In a quiet town in the American South, life wasn't as peaceful as it seemed. In a modest home on the outskirts, John, a hard-working middle-aged man, struggled to provide for his family. Once a successful office worker, an economic downturn had left him unemployed, forcing him into unstable freelance jobs. His wife, Emily, a resilient yet weary woman, did everything she could to support him, even as the weight of their financial struggles grew heavier each day. Their children, Sarah and Jack, were too young to fully understand, but they could feel the tension in the air. Sarah, a bright and perceptive 12-year-old, noticed the deepening lines of worry on her parents' faces. Jack, just 9, remained playful but sensed something was wrong whenever he saw his mother sitting quietly, lost in thought. The house felt heavier with every overdue bill, and meals became simpler as their savings dwindled. Yet, despite the uncertainty, they clung to the only thing that still held them together: love for one another. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but for now, they faced it as a family, bound by hope and the silent promise that somehow they would make it through. John sat at the worn-out kitchen table, his fingers running through his hair as he stared at the pile of overdue bills. The dim light overhead flickered, casting shadows that mirrored the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Across from him, Emily sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the nearly empty pantry. The fridge hummed softly, but its contents were dwindling. They had stretched every last dollar, yet it never seemed to be enough. Their freelance work barely covered the essentials, and now, with John's laptop malfunctioning, even that small source of income was in jeopardy. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, a sudden knock at the door shattered the uneasy quiet. Sarah and Jack stiffened, exchanging nervous glances. It was too late for visitors. John hesitated before rising, his heart pounding. When he cracked the door open, a man stood on the porch, his face partially obscured by the darkness. His voice was low but firm. "We need to talk. You know why I'm here." John's stomach twisted. He knew the man was a debt collector or worse. The kind who didn't send letters, didn't wait for payments, and certainly didn't take "I need more time" as an answer. Emily instinctively pulled the children closer, her mind racing through every possible escape. The air inside the house felt suffocating, thick with unspoken fear. Sarah clutched her mother's hand, sensing something was wrong. Jack, usually carefree, stood frozen, his wide eyes darting between his parents. They had been struggling for months, but this was different. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about survival. And for the first time, John realized they weren't just fighting poverty. They were fighting something much darker. John swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the doorknob. He knew this moment would come, but he had prayed that he would have more time. The man on the porch shifted slightly, his presence looming. "I don't like repeating myself," he said, his tone cold, calculated. "You have until the end of the week." Then, without another word, he stepped back into the darkness, leaving John standing there, heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the air was thick with silence. Emily pulled the children into the kitchen, away from the door, her mind racing. Sarah's grip on her arm was tight. "Mom, who was that?" she whispered. Emily forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Just someone looking for your dad," she said softly. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had never seen that look in her mother's eyes before: fear, raw and unfiltered. John finally turned from the door and met Emily's gaze. No words needed to be spoken. They were out of time, out of options. He sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. "I'll figure something out," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emily sighed, exhaustion etched into every inch of her face. "John, we can't keep living like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need help." But help wasn't easy to come by. Pride had kept John from asking, from reaching out. He had always been the provider, the protector. Admitting he needed help felt like failure. Yet, as he looked at his wife, at his children who were now whispering in hushed voices, sensing the weight of their parents' unspoken fears, she realized something. Pride wouldn't put food on the table. Pride wouldn't keep them safe. And if he wanted to protect his family, he would have to let it go. John lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The weight of the past few hours pressed down on him like an anchor. He could still hear the man's voice cold, unyielding, echoing in his head. End of the week. That wasn't much time. He turned to his side, watching Emily as she slept fitfully, her brows furrowed even in her dreams. He knew she was just as worried, just as terrified, but she was holding it together for the kids. As the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, John made a decision. He couldn't sit back and wait for things to get worse. He needed to act. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts, hesitating before finally pressing call. "Mark, it's me. I need a favor." Mark had been his best friend in college, a man who had built his own success from the ground up. They hadn't spoken in years, not since John had let pride drive a wedge between them. But now, none of that mattered. John explained everything: the debt, the threats, the fear of what might happen if he couldn't pay. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. "Meet me at the diner in an hour," Mark finally said. John exhaled, relief mixed with unease. He wasn't sure if Mark would actually help, or if this meeting would only end in another dead end. But at this point, he had no choice. He had to try. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit his face, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than dread. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break he had been waiting for. John pulled into the diner's nearly empty parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would send everything spiraling out of control. He sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield, watching the neon open sign flicker against the early morning sky. The place hadn't changed much since he and Mark used to meet here years ago, back when life was simpler, before bills stacked up and fear settled in like an unwanted house guest. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, a stark contrast to the weight pressing against his chest. He spotted Mark immediately sitting in the farthest booth, stirring a cup of black coffee, his expression unreadable. "John," Mark greeted, nodding as John slid into the seat across from him. "Mark, I wouldn't have called if I wasn't desperate," John admitted, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I need help. My family needs help." Mark studied him for a moment, then sighed. "I figured as much. You always had too much pride to ask for anything unless you had no other choice." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing, "How bad is it?" John hesitated. Saying it out loud made it feel even more real. "Bad. Real bad. I have until the end of the week before things get dangerous." Mark leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "I can help you, but there's a catch." His tone was calm, but something about the way he said it sent a chill down John's spine. John's stomach tightened. He had walked into this diner hoping for salvation, but something told him that whatever Mark was about to offer, it wasn't going to come without a cost. John swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had come here expecting a lifeline, a clean way out, but now, looking at Mark's unreadable expression, he wasn't so sure. "What's the catch?" John asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his gut. Mark exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down with a quiet clink. "I have a job for you," he said, leaning forward. "Nothing illegal, but it's not exactly easy either." John's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. He knew Mark well enough to understand that not illegal didn't necessarily mean safe. Still, he was out of options. "I need someone I can trust," Mark continued. "A warehouse downtown, small-time operation, but they need extra hands. It's long hours, rough work, but it pays fast." John hesitated. Warehouse work wasn't the issue, he'd done worse. But something about the way Mark was watching him, testing him, made his skin crawl. "This covers what I owe?" John asked finally. Mark gave a slow nod. "It'll be enough to get you out of trouble for now." For now. Those words lodged themselves in John's chest. He wasn't looking for a temporary fix. He wanted security, something lasting for his family. But beggars couldn't be choosers. He exhaled sharply, then extended his hand. "All right, I'll do it." Mark shook it, gripping firm. "Be at the warehouse tonight, midnight." John froze. Midnight? Something wasn't right. But as he walked out of the diner, his mind racing, he realized it didn't matter. Right or wrong, this was the only way forward. And for his family, he'd take the risk. John stepped out of the diner, his hands still numb from the handshake with Mark. The promise of help from an old friend brought a sense of relief, but he knew the situation wasn't over yet. Tonight, a new opportunity would either unfold or it would just be another loop of unfulfilled hopes. He wasn't sure. But one thing he knew for certain was that his family was still waiting, and that was the only reason he couldn't give up. When John walked into the house, Emily looked at him with questioning eyes. He gave a small nod, a tired smile briefly appearing on his haggard face. "I found a way," he said, and immediately her eyes softened. Sarah and Jack, though not fully understanding the situation, could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness. That night, as John was getting ready to leave, Emily gently took his hand. "No matter what happens, don't let it take away who you are," she whispered. Those words were like an anchor, keeping him from drifting too far from himself. Driving to the meeting, John realized something. Sometimes, the challenge isn't just overcoming hardship, but holding on to yourself while facing it. Money can settle debts, but only love and perseverance can truly change a life. And no matter what the future held, John knew one thing: he was no longer fighting alone.